in the winter of 1901. When the nights grew long and the wires sang softly in the cold, the telegraph was still considered a near miracle. Across North America and Europe, thousands of miles of copper lines stitched cities together. Messages that once took weeks by rail or sea now arrived in minutes, tapped out in careful rhythms by men and women trained to listen as much as to send. Telegraph offices were quiet places. Coal stoves hissed. Ink froze in bottles near the windows. Operators worked alone for hours at a time, copying pulses of sound into ledgers already thick with routine traffic, shipping orders, rail schedules, personal notes reduced to abbreviations and dots. In January of 1901, several such offices separated by distance, operated by people who did not know one another, began to record something unusual. Not dramatic, not loud, just out of place. The first reports came from small relay stations rather than city hubs, locations where traffic was light and patterns were predictable. Night shifts, mostly. Hours when the lines were supposed to be silent. One such station sat outside Toledo, Ohio, along a secondary rail spur. Another near York, England, handling regional traffic after midnight. A third, noted later in archived correspondence, operated from a weathered timber building outside Regina, then part of the Northwest Territories of Canada. The operators were experienced. Some had worked the key for over a decade. They knew the sound of static. They knew the irregular stutter of weather interference. They knew when a neighboring station was practicing or testing a line. What they logged did not resemble any of those things. According to duty books preserved in fragments, some later referenced in trade journals, others surviving only as quoted passages, the signals began as complete transmissions, not random clicks, not broken pulses, full messages. They arrived without call signs. No station identification preceded them. No response was requested. And when operators attempted to reply, the line returned to silence. At first, these entries were treated as errors, a misheard sequence, fatigue, the mind filling in meaning where there was none. One operator in Ohio wrote only a single line in his log. Line active 12:47 a.m. No originating station confirmed. Another, in England, underlined a sentence twice before crossing it out, then rewriting it more carefully, as if to distance himself from his first impression. Life in these offices continued as normal. Morning traffic arrived on time. Rail companies sent their updates. Weather warnings came through from coastal stations. No disruptions were reported. Supervisors saw nothing wrong in the tallies. But among the operators themselves, a quiet awareness began to form. The messages, when they appeared, shared certain features. They were brief. They followed proper spacing and cadence. They used older phrasing, sometimes slightly behind current commercial shorthand. And most unsettling of all, they appeared to be addressed to no one. By the end of January, a handful of operators had begun making private notes in the margins of their books. Not complaints, not formal reports, just observations. One wrote, "Sounded deliberate." Another felt waited for. None of them used the word impossible. Not yet. At this stage, there was still confidence in the system. Telegraphy was precise, logical, governed by known rules. Whatever was happening on the line, it was assumed that an explanation existed somewhere in the wires, the weather, or the human hand. But as the winter deepened, the silence between transmissions began to feel less empty, and the operators, sitting alone with the keys under their fingers, found themselves listening more closely than before, waiting not for the next scheduled message, but for the one that might arrive without being sent. The first disturbance was not recognized as such at the time. In early February of 1901, the unexplained transmissions were still regarded as technical anomalies, minor, irritating, but ultimately harmless. Telegraph lines were known to behave unpredictably during cold snaps. Ice formed along the wire. Wind caused minute oscillations. Solar activity, though poorly understood, was already suspected to interfere with electrical systems. So when the messages returned, operators reached first, for reason. At the Toledo relay station, the night operator identified in payroll records only as J.A. Mercer nodded a transmission at 1:13 a.m. The line had been inactive for nearly 40 minutes. No call sign preceded the signal. Mercer initially assumed a neighboring station had neglected protocol. He listened. The message came through clearly enough to be copied at normal speed. When it ended, Mercer waited for the customary follow-up or acknowledgement request. The message followed correct commercial form. Spacing was deliberate. Yet no station along that segment of line reported originating it. The following morning, Mercer mentioned the incident casually to a supervisor. The response was immediate and dismissive, weather interference, likely paired with operator fatigue. The ledger entry was not escalated. Across the Atlantic, a similar exchange occurred at a regional station outside York. She initially did not write the message down. It was not urgent, she wrote. None acknowledged sending anything. By mid-February, such reports had surfaced quietly in at least 5 locations, though only a fraction were formally logged. Most operators were reluctant to report incidents that could be attributed to personal error. The disturbances did not occur during storms. And there was something else. Several operators remarked, independently, that the signals seemed to begin only after the listener had fully settled at the desk, after the lamp was adjusted. One man in Canada, stationed near Regina, only to return and find the line silent again despite having heard activity moments earlier. No message was captured that night. He did not mention the incident to his superiors. By the end of the month, the mood among night operators had shifted. The unexplained transmissions were no longer curiosities. They were interruptions, uninvited presences on a system that prided itself on order. Still, every rational explanation was pursued. Lines were inspected, instruments recalibrated. Operators were reminded to rest their ears and confirm before logging irregular traffic. Nothing was found, and the messages did not stop. They waited, and when they came whole, unannounced, untraceable, and delivered with the calm certainty of something that expected to be heard. By March of 1901, the disturbances could no longer be treated as isolated incidents. What had begun as occasional, inconvenient transmissions became, if not frequent, then reliably recurrent. Enough that certain operators began to anticipate them. Enough that silence on the line no longer felt neutral. At the Toledo relay station, Mercer altered his habits. He began keeping the lamp turned lower. He stopped humming during long pauses. He sat closer to the receiver, listening not just for signal, but for its approach, the faint preparatory tremor in the wire that usually preceded legitimate traffic. On March 6th, just after midnight, the line activated without warning. This time, Mercer did not immediately copy the message. He listened through the entire transmission before touching his pencil. Later, when questioned informally by another operator, He admitted he had wanted to be certain it was not repeating. It did not. It was sent once, cleanly, and never again. When he finally wrote it down, he noted in the margin that the spacing was too even. Not mechanically even, but deliberate, as though paced by someone taking care not to rush. In England, Rawlings experienced something similar. Her station received 2 unexplained messages in the same week, both during the early hours, both absent any identifying header. She recorded that the second transmission arrived only minutes after she had finished copying routine traffic and closed her ledger. It did not interrupt, she wrote. It followed. That detail appeared again in other accounts. In Canada, the Regina operator, whose name does not appear in surviving records, reported in correspondence that the line had remained inactive through heavy snow and wind, only to produce a clear, measured transmission on a night of perfect calm. Operators began comparing notes in guarded ways, not through official channels, but in letters, margin, comments, and conversations held just out of earshot of supervisors. What emerged was not a shared message or repeated content, but shared conditions. The transmissions occurred during low activity, were never preceded by call signs, were never acknowledged by any known station, and ceased immediately when queried attempts to trap the phenomenon failed. Some operators tried leaving the receiver unattended. Nothing came through. Others deliberately tapped idle signals onto the line, hoping to provoke a response. The line remained quiet. One station attempted continuous monitoring with 2 operators present. No unexplained messages were recorded during those shifts. But when a single operator worked alone, late into the night, the disturbances returned. This correlation was never formally recorded. It remained an unspoken understanding. By mid-March, discomfort had replaced curiosity. Operators began describing the experience, not as hearing something arrive, but as being addressed. Several noted an odd sense of timing, as though the messages were delivered when attention was fully focused, and never when it was divided. No one suggested intent. Not openly. Instead, the language used was technical, restrained, unaccounted origin, improper initiation, non-responsive transmission. Yet in private writings, a different tone emerged. Rawlings wrote that she had begun dreading the sound of the line activating without warning, not because of fear, but because of the effort required to remain calm while copying something that should not exist. Mercer, in a later margin note, wrote simply, "I no longer believe this is noise." Still, no explanation was offered. The system showed no faults. The equipment behaved as designed, and the messages, however misplaced, were flawless in form. By the end of March, a quiet tension settled over the night shifts. The operators continued their work. They recorded what they heard. They followed procedure. But now, when the line fell silent, the silence felt provisional, as if something on the other end of the wire was merely waiting for the room to empty, the hour to deepen, and one attentive listener to remain. The breaking point did not arrive as a sudden shock. It came gradually, through accumulation, through one message too many, arriving at an hour when the line should have been irrevocably dead. In early April of 1901, several stations adjusted their schedules. Maintenance was completed. Winter damage to the lines had been addressed. Supervisors expected the irregularities to fade with the season. They did not. At the Toledo relay station, Mercer worked what would later be noted as his final, uninterrupted night shift. Shortly after 2 a.m., the line activated. No atmospheric conditions were recorded. No traffic was scheduled. The neighboring stations were logged as inactive. Mercer copied the message in full. What followed was an unusual nod in the signal, but in Mercer's reaction. According to a later account from a colleague, he remained seated for several minutes after the transmission ended, hands off the key, pencil resting on the page. When asked about it the next morning, he said only that the message had ended as though it had finished saying what it came to say. He requested a line inspection. The inspection found nothing. That same week, in England, Rawlings experienced what she later described as her most unsettling shift. The message came through just before dawn, during the quiet interval between night traffic and the first morning dispatches. She recorded that she felt compelled to copy it immediately, without listening through first. When it ended, she realized she had been holding her breath. She attempted to signal a response, then stopped herself. Instead, she waited. Nothing followed. In her private journal, she wrote that for the first time. She wondered whether replying was a mistake, that the absence of response might be intentional, even necessary. Elsewhere, at the Regina station, the unnamed operator experienced a more tangible reaction. After copying an unexplained transmission, he reportedly shut down his equipment and left the office before his shift had ended. He cited illness. Within days, supervisors began receiving formal complaints not about interference, but about strain, fatigue, nervousness, and inability to concentrate during long, silent periods. No two operators described the experience in the same way, but their concerns converged around a shared point. The messages were no longer merely anomalous. They were intrusive. What made this phase different was not content, no. Preserved record suggests the messages became threatening or explicit but frequency. Some stations reported 2 or 3 incidents within a single week. Always brief, always precise, always untraceable. One senior technician, brought in to assess the situation, reportedly remarked that the signals behaved as if the line itself were choosing when to speak. The comment was not included in any official report. After mid-April, subtle changes occurred. Operators began refusing night shifts. Some requested transfers. Others insisted on working with the door open, or with another operator present even, when policy did not require it. A few stopped recording the unexplained transmissions altogether, leaving gaps in their logs where activity should have been noted. The system, on paper, appeared to return to normal. But among those who had listened, truly listened, the understanding had shifted. Whatever was happening on the wires was no longer something that could be ignored, corrected, or waited out. It had crossed a threshold. And though no one could say precisely when or how, there was a growing sense that the messages were not merely arriving by chance. They were arriving because someone somewhere was still listening. And soon, the effort to maintain silence would prove more difficult than anyone expected. By late April of 1901, the disturbances had begun to leave marks that could not be measured on instruments. They appeared instead in behavior. At the Toledo relay station, Mercer submitted a formal request to be reassigned to daytime duty. The document survives only as a reference in later correspondence, but it notes prolonged strain due to irregular night activity. No further explanation was offered. He was granted the transfer. He never worked another overnight shift. In England, Rawlings did not request reassignment, but her journals show a change in tone. Where earlier entries were observational, later ones became shorter, more factual, as though she were consciously limiting how much she committed to paper. She continued to log the unexplained transmissions when they occurred, but stopped adding commentary. No speculation, no impressions. Just time, duration, and silence afterward. In Canada, the Regina operator resigned altogether. Officially, it was attributed to health concerns. Unofficially, a colleague later recalled that he had begun sleeping poorly and refused to sit alone with the receiver. He said it felt like waiting for someone to finish speaking, the colleague remembered, even when nothing was coming. Across multiple stations, similar decisions followed. Night shifts were shortened. Staffing was increased where possible. Some supervisors quietly instructed operators to disregard unidentifiable signals unless they disrupted scheduled traffic. This had the effect intended or not of erasing the phenomenon from official records. Yet traces remained in trade publications of the period. Small notices appeared discussing phantom signaling and known origin transmissions, usually framed as technical curiosities. No causes were proposed. No follow-up articles appeared. Privately, operators exchanged letters. These letters were careful. No one made claims. No one suggested purpose. But many expressed relief at no longer being alone with the line. One letter, quoted decades later in a regional history, reads, "I do not miss the quiet. I only miss knowing what the quiet means." Psychological effects were noted, though not formally studied. Operators reported heightened, startled responses, difficulty distinguishing expected signals from unexpected ones, a lingering sense of anticipation during silence. Some continued to hear the imagined click of the key long after leaving their posts. By early summer, the unexplained messages became less frequent or, at least, less reported. Whether this was due to genuine decline or deliberate omission is unclear. What is certain is that the immediate response was not investigation, but withdrawal. No broad inquiry was launched. No public warning issued. No consensus reached. The telegraph system, vital to commerce and governance, was not a thing that authorities wished to portray as uncertain or vulnerable. So the incidents were allowed to recede. They were folded into routine explanations. But among those who had been present, they had experienced order appearing where order should not have been. That whatever had spoken on the wire had not been stopped. And silence, they had learned, was not the same as absence.
By the time 1945 arrived, Truck Lagoon had become little more than a ghost. Ships lay rusting beneath turquoise waters. Airfields, once buzzing with life, were overgrown and silent. The sprawling warehouses and tunnels that had supported hundreds of vessels and thousands of personnel were empty, decaying, and abandoned. Nature was reclaiming the islands, but the scars of war remained etched into the landscape, both above and below the surface. For the Japanese Navy, Truck's 11 without a formal invasion was emblematic of a painful truth. Their strategic assumptions had been shattered. They had invested in strongholds, in concentrated firepower, and in the illusion that geography alone could protect them. But the Americans had proven that mobility, intelligence, and technological innovation could bypass walls of steel and render fortresses obsolete. The Truck was never retaken. The Japanese garrison that remained trapped on the islands slowly dwindled due to starvation, disease, and isolation. Thousands of men survived the war physically intact, only to return home with a bitter knowledge that their fortress, the one they had believed would stop the U.S. Navy, had been neutralized without them firing a single decisive shot. For the U.S. Navy, Truck became both a tactical victory and a symbol of a new kind of warfare. It demonstrated the lethal efficiency of carrier aviation, the value of intelligence, and the effectiveness of bypassing heavily fortified positions in favor of operational flexibility. The attack on Truck Operation Hailstone killed thousands, sank dozens of ships, and destroyed hundreds of aircraft, yet it cost the Americans relatively few lives. The lagoon became a proving ground for the strategies that would ultimately bring Japan to its knees. Today, Truck is a diver's paradise. Beneath the surface, hundreds of wrecked ships and aircraft lie in eerie repose. Schools of fish swim through twisted metal. Coral has grown over gun turrets and bombed-out holes. What was once the Pacific's most feared stronghold has become a peaceful, haunting underwater graveyard, a reminder of how quickly human ingenuity and determination can render even the most formidable defenses irrelevant. The story of Truck is more than a tale of ships and bombs. It is a story of perception and reality, of confidence and hubris, of strategy and adaptation. Japan believed it had built a fortress that would stop the U.S. Navy, but in the end, it was ideas, not walls, and guns that determined the outcome of the Pacific War, and there is a lesson in that. For historians and strategists alike, no fortress is ever truly impregnable. The strongest walls can be bypassed, the most confident defenders can be surprised, and the vast ocean that once seemed to provide safety can, in the right hands, become the pathway for total destruction. Truck Lagoon stands today not as a monument to Japan's power, but as a silent witness to the shifting tides of war. Its waters tell a story of ambition, of preparation, of hubris, and ultimately of the relentless advance of strategy and innovation. As divers glide through the wrecks, and historians pore over declassified documents, one truth becomes clear. The fortress that Japan believed would stop the U.S. Navy never had to fall in battle to fall in significance. Its defeat was a lesson in the evolution of warfare, a lesson written not in textbooks alone, but in the very bones of the ships that rest beneath the waves. And as we remember Truck today, we are reminded of the fragility of power, the courage of those who fought, and the unpredictable currents of history that can change the fate of empires in a matter of days. If this story of the Pacific's most famous fortress fascinated you, make sure to subscribe and join us for more incredible untold tales from history where strategy, courage, and the unexpected collide.